For this vintage lens video, we're going wide. Vintage ultra-wide lenses are a rare breed. Back in the 1970s and 80s, there wasn't a huge amount of options if you wanted an ultra-wide lens that wasn't a fisheye. And from all of the research that I've done for this video, I've only found 5. There are 4 15mm f3.5 lenses from Zeiss, Leica, Nikon, and Pentax, and there is the one unicorn, the Canon FD 14mm f2.8. You may be wondering why I haven't added the Leica R 15mm f2.8 to this list, and that is because they are insanely expensive and they were made in 2001. So they're not really the same era as the rest of these lenses. Also, they only made like 420 of them, so they are crazy rare. Of the 5 lenses that we will be looking at today, only the Canon and the Pentax have an aspherical element. Most of the Canon FD L lenses have aspherical elements, and the 14mm is no different. Supposedly with the Pentax, the first 400 lenses that they made had an aspherical element in its construction. 300 of these were the M42 mount, and only 100 of these were the K mount, so this one is exceptionally rare. After the first 400 lenses, Pentax completely redesigned this lens to have all spherical elements because the aspherical elements were just too costly to produce. If you want to know if you have an aspherical Pentax 15mm, all you have to do is look at the top line of the focus scale. If it reads 742, then you have a very rare aspherical lens. And if it reads 732, then you have the later spherical version. There is an easy way to test this. The grinding of an aspherical element will produce onion skinning in the bokeh balls. And if we zoom in enough, and on a 15mm, we have to zoom way in, we can in fact see onion skinning. According to my research here, both Pentax and Zeiss brought a 15mm prototype to Photokina in 1972. Both of these lenses supposedly shared very similar optical designs, and if you look at them, they also look very similar. Supposedly though, the Pentax had an aspherical element and the Zeiss was all spherical. The production version of the Pentax was basically exactly the same as the prototype at Photokina, but Zeiss redesigned the lens for production to incorporate a floating element design. The Zeiss is a 15mm HFT lens, so it's before the T-star coating, and it's not part of this test because I've never even seen one come up for sale. So I can't really get my hands on it if I can't find it. This Zeiss 15mm was redesigned for the Contax line, and looking at this lens next to the Leica, you might be thinking they look incredibly alike, and they are. The glass for the Leica 15mm is the same glass that is in the Contax 15mm, but it has Leica's coatings and a slightly changed body design. The Nikon 15mm was made in the 1980s for the AIS series of lenses. I did an entire video about Nikon AIS lenses last year, so go check that out. And it's a great lens. The Canon 14mm f2.8 is a marvel of optical engineering for its time. Though not by much, it is both wider and faster than the other 4 lenses here today. This lens was launched in 1982, and from my research, it wasn't until the year 2000 that another 14mm f2.8 photo lens was launched, which was the Nikon ED AF lens. Canon did release an EF 14mm in 1991, but I'm not counting this since they already had the design from the FD, so they basically just slapped it into an EF housing. Before getting into image quality on these lenses, I just want to state that a couple of my lenses are not perfect. The Leica R that I have has a tiny scratch on the rear element, so mine may flare a little differently than yours. Also, the Nikon has a tiny bit of haze around one of the rear elements, which can cause it to flare quite a bit wide open. This does go away when stopping down though. I would have loved to test perfect copies of all of these lenses, but I have been limited by what was available at the time that I was looking, as well as my own bank account. I think the fact these 5 lenses are in one place being tested head to head is impressive in itself. Each of these lenses use their company's own multi-coatings, which is a big way that they get their look. The Zeiss uses the T-Star coating, the Leica uses its own, the Pentax uses their super multi-coating, the Nikon uses its own formula, and the Canon uses their Super Spectra coating. All of these tests were shot using the Sony FX3 with the same white balance and using the Phantom LUT's neutral S-Log3 to Rec 709 conversion. Even though the Leica uses Zeiss glass, it still has that classic Leica look and it matches perfectly with a Leica R set. And I think that just goes to show how much these companies' multi-coatings affect the image of these lenses. Wide open, the Leica is quite sharp with great colors and contrast. Stopping down to f5.6 sharpens up the image a little bit, but doesn't really do much to an already great image. Wide open, the Zeiss is equally as sharp as the Leica since they use the same glass, but it has more of that neutral look that you'll get from the Contax line. Stopping down to f5.6 sharpens a little, but doesn't really do too much. Wide open, the Nikon is actually a little soft and very low contrast, but it still has great colors. If any of you have this lens, please let me know if you have similar performance wide open or if this is abnormal. I don't think this is caused by the little bit of haze in the rear element, because when you stop down to f5.6, the image is a lot sharper with great contrast, and usually if you stop down a lens with haze, it's still gonna be kind of milky. Wide open, the Pentax is pretty sharp, but seems to have a bit less contrast than some of the others. Stopping down to f5.6 doesn't seem to do too much in terms of sharpness, but it does add contrast. Wide open, the Canon is pretty sharp with great colors and contrast. You can see the slight exposure boost that we get from the f2.8 aperture versus the f3.5 of the other lenses. Stopping down the image to f5.6 sharpens up a little bit and adds contrast. Something that I really wanted to see is how much of a difference you get from 14mm versus 15mm. And I also wanted to check if all of the 15mm show the exact same field of view. For this, I set the toy camera to a focus distance of 12 inches and slapped on each lens. I set this shot up with the window on the far left and a candle on the far right, and then just judging how much of either object we could see. And to my surprise, at 12 inches, the 15mm do not all show the same field of view. The Leica and Zeiss show the least amount, while the Pentax and Nikon show a decent bit more. When all these lenses are focused to infinity though, they do show a very similar field of view. And then obviously the Canon shows the most with its extra 1mm, which is no surprise. I'm gonna get one thing out of the way real quick, and that is that all of these lenses flare when there is a strong light source in the frame. If you're looking for a vintage ultra-wide lens that doesn't flare, then none of these lenses are for you, and you probably shouldn't be looking at vintage lenses anyway. That out of the way, I am a huge sucker for good lens flares, and it is one of the main things I look for when buying lenses. I love it. And all of these 5 lenses flare beautifully. Since these lenses have just so many elements packed into them, you get some crazy, diverse flares with just the light going through all the elements. The Canon probably has my favorite lens flares out of the bunch, with a couple circles forming in the flares when the light is aimed right down the barrel, and one red outer ring at the far end. This looks very similar to the flares I get with my FD L 50mm that I just tested, and I am very pleased about that. You also get some nice lens flares when the light is off center, and I love it. The Zeiss has very nice but neutral flares, and it goes along perfectly with the rest of the Contax lenses. This is a great lens if you want a more neutral vintage look. The Leica looks a lot like the Zeiss since they have the same optics, but you get a couple different colors and tones due to Leica's coatings. If you want the Leica R look, this 15mm absolutely delivers. The Pentax has some fun flares for sure. It has a large center flare like the others, but it blooms quite a bit more than the others, which is leading me to believe that there might be a little bit of moisture in this lens, even though I inspected it thoroughly when I got it and I didn't see any trace of it. The Nikon has some crazy flares, and it probably flares the most out of the bunch. Wide open, my copy blooms like crazy due to that little bit of haze that is in the rear element. Stop down, it has much more contrast, but still has some very cool flares. Even though all these lenses are rectilinear ultra-wide lenses, they were designed some 40 plus years ago, and they're bound to have a little bit of distortion. Although to my surprise, all of these were very well corrected. All of these lenses show a similar amount of barrel distortion and maybe the tiniest bit of mustache distortion. But if you notice anything that I didn't, if one of them looks a lot worse, let me know. I didn't have an actual distortion chart for this, so I just saved a photo of one on my phone and then streamed it to my TV and set it up there. With lenses this wide, a good minimum focus distance can help you get some really unique angles. The Pentax and the Nikon have the farthest minimum focus at 0.3 meters. The Canon is the next closest at 0.25 meters. And the Zeiss and Leica have by far the closest minimum focus out of the bunch at 0.16 meters, which is almost half of what the minimum focus is of the Pentax and the Nikon. And just to put it into perspective, 0.16 meters is about 6.3 inches, which means that with these lenses, the minimum focus point is almost touching the front element. I'm sure if you were filming a person at minimum focus distance, their breath would be fogging up the lens. It seems that incorporating that floating element design really did wonders for the minimum focus distance, and you can get some really unique angles with these that you just can't get with the others. At minimum focus, the Leica and Zeiss can actually create some pretty blurry backgrounds, which is pretty surprising considering they're ultra-wide lenses that only open up to f3.5. They can actually blow out the background even more than the Canon, even though they're slower. The Pentax and Nikon definitely have the least amount of background blur, simply because they can't focus anywhere near as close as the others. None of these minimum focus distances are bad by any means. The Zeiss and Leica are just hella impressive in this regard. And actually, when the Zeiss and Leica are at their minimum focus, the field of view is actually very similar to when the Pentax and Nikon are at their close focus. Here's the difference between a 0.3 meter minimum focus distance and a 0.16 meter. It's really impressive that Zeiss was able to engineer this in 1975. Focus breathing can be really distracting for a viewer if it's bad enough. Thankfully, with lenses this wide, I don't know how often you'll be rack focusing quickly from close to infinity, and so it might not be an issue for you at all. For these tests, keep an eye on the edges of the screen and look for how much the image appears to zoom in and out while focusing. The Leica and Zeiss have by far the most breathing out of the bunch, but I think that mostly comes down to the fact that it can focus twice as close as the others. The Canon has pretty well controlled breathing, but it is not the best out of the bunch. The Pentax and Nikon though, they have incredibly low amounts of breathing, the Nikon having very little. But this also may be because they have the worst minimum focus distance. Since these lenses are so rare, you can imagine they'd be pretty costly. And you'd be right. Out of the five, the Pentax and Nikon are usually the cheapest and can be found for around $800 to $1,200. Make sure you keep an eye out for the aspherical version of the Pentax though. The Zeiss is the next cheapest at $1,500 to $2,500, which is very expensive, but apparently when this lens was new, it adjusted for inflation, it cost about 30 grand, which is absolutely ridiculous when you think that you can go buy a brand new Rokinon ultra wide for a few $100s. The Leica is next on the list, and this lens typically sells for between $2,200 and $3,200. I couldn't find anywhere what this lens sold for new, but I can imagine it was about the same as the Zeiss, if not a little more. And from what I could find, they only made about 3,000 of these Leica 15mm. The Canon is by far the most expensive lens here. And originally, this test was only gonna be the 4 15mm f3.5 lenses until a 14mm popped up for a price I just could not say no to. So I have it. FD lenses in general have seen a massive price increase in the last few years, and the 14mm is no different, as this lens typically costs between $5,500 and $8,000. That price is just absolutely ridiculous, but then again, it is the widest rectilinear vintage lens ever made and is faster than the others. Obviously, there's not a single lens here that I would say is the clear winner, but that wasn't the point of this test to begin with. Everyone is gonna have their favorite lens from the bunch, and I cannot wait to see you all battle it out in the comments. This could get messy down there. Anyway, that is gonna do it for today's video. This was an incredibly expensive video to make, and I have spent the last 4 years hunting down each of these lenses. So if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, that would mean a ton. But with all that being said, I'll see you in the next one.
Look it, I got a tattoo. His name is Henry.